Hi, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Royal Secrets by Stephen Barry. I have really enjoyed reading your comments all through this series because a lot of you are blown away by the way he portrays the then Prince Charles. He portrays in such a warm and affectionate and witty way, and it's heartwarming and it's easy listening, and sometimes I think we need that, don't we? So, on with it, and this chapter is called Courting Danger. The Prince does take risks, far too many for both the Queen and now the Princess of Wales' comfort. He yearns to ride in the Grand National, but the weight of opposition is too great. I doubt it will ever happen. When he came off his horse Good Prospect in 1981 at a steeplechase meeting at Sandown, that probably finished all his chances of having a crack at the National. Probably the most dangerous thing the Prince had ever done was in the Northwest Territories of Canada. Now, the Prince wanted to get as near as possible to the Arctic, so they all finished up in a place called Resolute Bay. Now, at Resolute Bay, the scientists had dug a great big hole in the ice, and one of them, Joseph McInnes, was taking photographs of marine life under the Arctic. Now, this was all organised before they left England, so Prince Charles had had the sign-off to do this, and this was actually incredibly dangerous, really. To dive under the ice is always incredibly dangerous, but the Prince was known to be a really good skin diver, so it was reasonably safe for him to go. A tent had been placed over the hole in the ice and they were all gathered for the descent. The hole itself was the size of about 4 manhole covers. That's not big enough for me. No. The depth of the ice, 20 inches, getting thinner all the time, even back then, and the water below was jet black. No light would get through. He disappeared down the hole like a big red and blue balloon because he had this special suit on that they pump air into to keep his body warm so that the cold water doesn't actually touch him. And about 9 of us stood around the edge. Lamps had been lowered into the water to guide him. Oh, that's good. Doesn't sound very high-tech though, does he? And he and Joseph McInnes, who was accompanying him, had underwater torches. Good. John McLean and I were wondering if we would ever see him again. God, I said, we might be looking for another job. Oh, well, that's full of empathy. Just worrying about your job, Stephen Barry. Heaven forbid, said John. He was gone about 10 minutes, but it seemed like 10 hours. When he finally bobbed up again and was pulled out and the mask came off, he looked frightfully pleased with himself. That was fascinating, he said. I enjoyed it. As it was, he was qualified to fly helicopters and turboprop planes, but not jets. He could fly the Andovers of the Queen's Flight and frequently does. When we went to Ghana and the Gold Coast in 1975, he did practically all the flying. But now he just likes to take off and land. He leaves the boring bits when the plane is on automatic to the co-pilot. John McLean and I used to give him points for his landings. So they had these cards with numbers on them, and they used to give him a score out of 10 for his takeoff and landings. And, it was a source of great amusement to the Prince. He just absolutely loved it. He probably loved the attention. A bumpy one rated under 5, a smooth finish, gave him a perfect 10. Polo, of course, while a gentleman's sport, well, of course, polo's in the news at the moment, isn't it, with the Polo Netflix special? And then Stephen Barry said, although it's known as a gentleman's sport, I did sometimes wonder, hearing the language coming from the field, it's hardly a gentle sport. It's a very fast game, but the Prince is fearless. He has had some nasty crashes. He cut his chin rather badly and has the scar to prove it. And no doubt there's another from the bloodied mouth he got at Windsor in June 1982. He says scars do not matter. I'm not a pop singer, he announced. Good on you, Charles. He's not overly fussed about a bit of a rough scar. Probably adds to his sort of manly aura. Then Stephen Barry goes on to say how terribly expensive polo is to play. It really costs a lot of money. And he goes on to say that polo is probably his greatest extravagance. Then comes hunting, which thank God is only a short season. He always thought he was doing me a favour by saying, "Do you want to follow the hunt today?" "I'd love to," I'd say bravely, and I got in the car and sat there for hours and hours, watching a herd of overdressed people occasionally charge past on horses before they disappeared into the far distance. Now, they went off to play polo in Florida. They were on their way to somewhere else, and he played on a really, really hot day, and it was one of those rare occasions where the then Prince Charles had really a medical emergency. He ended up in hospital with really severe dehydration. He had to stay overnight. He couldn't walk properly. The whole thing when you're really seriously dehydrated, it can be quite dangerous. And he had to go on a glucose drip and everything. And he lay there quietly, but his voice was very weak. And Stephen Barry had to organise his jammies and his toothbrush and everything to be sent to the hospital. When he finally got out the next day, Stephen Barry said to him, "Are you all right, sir?" I asked as a shaky prince appeared out of a huge Mercedes. I always seemed to be asking him if he was all right, but then again it was my job to be sure that he was all right. "I think so," he said, "but I did feel most peculiar yesterday. I didn't feel as if I was dying, but I felt very strange." He shook his head. "I've never passed out in my life, so I don't know how it feels, but I felt as if I might be about to faint." So that was really ruined that trip. For the rest of the trip, there was another 2 or 3 days. He had to just sit and watch. He couldn't actually play polo. He didn't go to any of the parties that were thrown in his honour. So all in all, it was a bit of a dud trip. The following week, he was off somewhere else and I was going to go down to Fort Lauderdale for a holiday of my own. "When are you coming back?" he asked as I saw him off at the airport. "The day before you, sir," I told him. "Why don't you fly back with me?" he suggested. "It's a scheduled flight." I was pleased to be asked and delighted to accept. He did rather like me to be with him. I was a face he knew. It was much easier to ask me to do things for him than someone else. He was comfortable with me. So I changed my booking and was there in case he needed me on his flight home. And that's the end of that chapter. So you get another one. You always get another one. Chapter 12 is titled Travels with My Prince. It was President Sadat's funeral that finally confirmed my decision to leave the prince. Once so excited at the thought of travelling around the world, I'd had enough. I felt when we returned from that short and rather alarming trip to Egypt that if I even went 5 miles further than the King's Road, I wouldn't care. So he was over it. He was completely over it. He didn't want to do it anymore. The news of the president's assassination came through when we were on the Scottish end of the Prince and Princess's honeymoon in 1981. So the prince was out stalking and the princess was actually just resting upstairs in their bedroom. And when the prince came back into the hallway, Stephen Barry met him in the hall and said, "Mr. Ardeen called, Your Highness. Can you ring him? I'm afraid it's not very good news." He was pulling off his rubber boots. "Who is it this time?" he said, his voice resigned. "It's President Sadat, sir. He's been assassinated." "Oh dear," he said. "How awful. How did you hear?" "First on the radio and then Mr. Ardeen, sir," I said. He nodded and then asked, "Where's the princess?" "She was resting. We haven't told her," I told him. "Fine," he said, and shaking his head, he went off to tell her himself. Now, the reason why they hadn't told Princess Diana was that the president and his wife had actually joined them on the Royal Yacht Britannia during their honeymoon, and they'd actually got quite close. They did quite a few intimate dinners together, and so they knew that it would actually really upset the Princess of Wales, so they left it for her husband to break it to her gently. It was immediately decided that he would represent the UK at the funeral as the Queen and Prince Philip were actually in Australia. He wanted to go. He genuinely liked the president. The princess wanted to accompany him, but he wouldn't hear of it because it was just considered really dangerous, just far too dangerous. And she wasn't happy about that. She was anxious for his safety and would have been happier if he'd just stayed at home. We had 2 days to prepare before the prince left for Cairo. "What are the weather conditions there?" he asked me, a familiar question before every trip. "Very hot, sir," I said. "Then I'll ask if naval tropical kit will be all right." We were quite a small party, the Prince, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, with 2 of his staff, Mr. Ardeen, 2 police officers, and I. We stayed at the British ambassador's residence in Cairo for one night after you arrived, and the plane that was to fly us back next day directly after the funeral. But the morning of the funeral, the tension intensified. Egyptians had tremendous security problems with the Prince, 3 former US presidents and Henry Kissinger, as well as assorted royalty and the heads of state were all in town. And they were well aware that most of the assassins who had actually killed President Sadat had not been caught and would still be roaming the streets. Now, it was decided that the situation was so fraught that everyone that wasn't crucial to the funeral, being the Prince and his police protection officer, should actually head to the airport and wait by the plane. That way, if they needed to get the Prince out in a big rush, in a big emergency situation, they would only have to get 2 to the airport. So Stephen Barry and Lord Carrington, all the secretaries, actually ended up on the hot tarmac outside the plane for 5 hours. And I think that probably played into the fact that Stephen Barry was just sick of everything and just wanted to get out of there. Maybe he was just, really didn't want to be in these dangerous situations anymore. When the Prince finally arrived at the airport and was about to board the plane, Stephen Barry observed that he looked really shaken. "We had one bad moment," the Prince said. "It was a very strange feeling. There was a group of guards who seemed to be on crowd control standing in front of us. Quite suddenly they turned around and were facing us with their guns pointing straight at us. John and Jim," his 2 policemen, there was 2 with him, "nearly had apoplexy. I suppose it was just a question of bad organisation, but it did give us an awful fright. We weren't sure exactly what they were going to do until they just moved on." And the Prince refused to wear a bulletproof vest. Everyone else had on a bulletproof vest, but he refused to wear one. And so, there was genuine concern about his safety. "People always seem to die when they're at Balmoral," observed Stephen Barry. "This complicated things for me, getting the Prince's wardrobe together, because funerals were always a really quick trip." And he said New Zealand was the worst. One minute they're enjoying Balmoral, next they're on an interminable 13-hour flight, then straight back to Balmoral via London before we had time to gather our breath. It was on the plane. Stephen Barry actually worked really hard. "I never slept before the Prince had settled down. I literally slept at the foot of my master's bed. I had to be on call in case he wanted anything." Now, the VC-10s we flew on, the RAF planes, were normally used for troop movements and were not equipped with any luxuries. There was no full bathrooms. The interiors were very basic. The toilet facilities are much the same as on any commercial flight. The Prince always used an electric razor to shave, as there was no question of him cutting his throat at 20,000 feet. Now, on one of these numerous overseas trips, they actually stopped back in Mexico and they stayed at the late Merle Oberon's house in Acapulco. Now, Prince Philip and she were very, very old friends. Now, there's always been rumours and innuendo about the fact that they had an affair when she was very young and beautiful and he was very young and handsome, but that hasn't been really verified by anybody as yet. But they were definitely very close friends, and that continued throughout her whole life. And so the Prince suggested that Charles and his entourage actually stay with her, as it would be pleasanter than a hotel. Of course, she was quite old when we went to her home, but still beautiful. A tiny little lady of immense charm. She was married to a Mexican tin man, very rich, of course. Time meant nothing at her house. It was 10:30 at night before dinner was served and 2 o'clock in the morning before it was finished. The Prince had his "is this ever going to end" face on. Now, this is interesting about the organisation of foreign trips, and I sort of think it does give us an insight into how much more difficult it would be for Prince Harry now he's out of that organisation, outside of all that machinery, because it just ran like clockwork. An advance team would go off to a foreign country and make sure that everything was organised and everything was perfect. Most of the time, everything went smoothly on our travels. Before a major trip is undertaken, someone from the prince's office goes and covers the ground, a kind of advance man. Usually the private secretary, the policeman and the press secretary will go ahead and plot the whole trip in advance, checking that every room is suitable. They know exactly where he's staying, who he will meet before he even sets off. And when they come back, they make final adjustments and recommendations to the official program. There are times when it seemed we spent our lives in the air, trying to keep some pattern to time so that we were not completely disorientated and jet-lagged when they got to the other end. It bothered the prince, though, very little. He likes moving on. 3 days anywhere is enough for him, unless it's Balmoral or Highgrove. But after that, if he's overseas after 3 days, he becomes very restless. When we flew commercial, it was quite different, of course. These flights were rather boring. The prince never drinks, so none of the rest of us would take advantage of all that lovely free first-class champagne. Oh, what a waste, what a waste. Now, of course, when Prince Charles was taking a commercial flight, that would usually hold up the flight because a lot more checking of bags would happen, even back in those days. And, often the flights could get delayed for up to 2 hours. Now, in order to compensate the other passengers, the captain of the flight would often offer an open bar for the duration of the flight to compensate people. Now, on one particular flight from San Francisco to Sydney, when this offer was made, loud Australian cheers came from the back, and the prince said, "Oh, God," and offered his condolences to the crew. So when they arrived in Sydney, most of the passengers, good old Aussies, were legless. The stewards walking around in a daze, and the plane was bone dry. A lot of surprised first-class passengers have found themselves sitting near the prince, and he creates a rather silent flight with everyone on their best behaviour. Rather like the parties he attends, the noise level always increases by several decibels after he's left. That actually sounds rather dull, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be awful to be constantly having people around you on their best behaviour in public? I mean, you just would really want people to just relax and have a good time. I always thought that if I ever met the prince, that aside from being respectful and hopefully doing all the right protocol, I would try to be myself so that at least he would have, a few moments of someone being normal around him. I must say, working for him gave me some spectacular treats. Once we flew the Concorde to New York just to go to the ballet and then right back again. Now, this is cute. Qantas could not pay for publicity like this. So, Qantas, if you're watching, you can slip me a few bucks for reading this sentence out. Qantas was a favourite airline. They were always so agreeable about sending an aircraft if the prince needed one. So, come on. Sponsorship. I'm only kidding. This video is not sponsored by Qantas. When the Prince of Wales travels, he becomes a Howard Hughes character because he never goes out, and it's due to security. When he wants to go out for a walk, he has to take about 10 policemen with him, and he wants to go for a swim or a surf in Australia, a whole mob has to go along too. The security is intense. Now, of course, on many trips, a lot of women ran up to him in those days and wanted to kiss him. This is pre-Princess Diana because, of course, Stephen Barry's going back over, previous trips to the Egyptian one that he took with the prince. When he's away, all he wants to do is get back home. He loves Britain. He loves being here. In years to come, I believe they will have to lever him out of this country for state visits and overseas tours. Some trips are more fun than others. He had this great ambition to see the United States, and one day at Balmoral, when we were out with the guns, he said to me, "I may be going on a tour of America soon. Would you like to come?" "Try to keep me away," I said. He'd been there before with Princess Anne in 1970 when Nixon was president, and Nixon had been made fairly determined to matchmake him with his very pretty daughter, Patricia. So Patricia, Nixon and the prince, eh? Nixon saw it as a great double, but the prince had other ideas. "At least I won't have a daughter to face this time," he said before he left. So it sounds like the prince didn't like being matchmaked all that much. So while he was there, they were actually in Atlanta and he met Gladys Knight and the Pips, which was just such a thrill backstage. But he went on to Texas and he stayed at a ranch. Now, the prince was intrigued by Texans and their lifestyle. The American millionaires at that party fascinated him. Just absolutely fascinated him. He was fascinated by someone who made money through their own efforts. After the dinner, he said to me, "Do you realise that the amassed wealth in that room tonight is supposed to represent our national debt?" One of the engagements was a huge charity dinner for 1,000 people, which was arranged by the Variety Club. Ronald Reagan, as a former governor of California, and the prince ended up sitting next to an older American lady whose husband had arranged the whole thing. But squadron leader Checketts was delighted to find himself next to Sophia Loren, and the prince was absolutely spewing about that. He wanted to be next to Sophia Loren. But he did get a chance because he was sat next to Lauren Bacall at another function. They went to visit the 20th Century Fox film studios, and slightly overcome by her proximity, blurted out, "I so enjoyed all your black and white films, Miss Bacall." And she said, "I'm not that old, Prince." He also got to visit the Charlie's Angels set, and he was whisked away for a photo call with Farrah Fawcett Major. They were all very glamorous, he said afterwards, but aren't they small? Particularly Farrah Fawcett Major. She looks much taller on the screen. He seemed a little bit disappointed because apparently, according to Stephen Barry, the prince liked tall women. Now, of course, he saw the Hello Dolly set while he was at 20th Century Fox. And back in his Navy days, when he was captain of the Minesweeper, he actually had met Barbra Streisand when she was filming Funny Lady, I think. Funny Girl or Funny Lady, can't remember which one. And it was very stilted because she was rather shy. She was very busy. She was in between takes, and so it was a little bit awkward. But he said he didn't care. He just loved meeting her, just loved her. I'm sure they thought I'd say Raquel Welch, he told me, but I said Barbra Streisand. I wanted to meet the woman behind the voice. I think I caught her on a bad day, though. She was terribly busy, but he wasn't at all disappointed, just pleased to have seen her. He likes her music and said that it had been an enjoyable experience watching her work. An awful lot of girls kissed him, which he quite liked, but the kissing began to get out of hand. And once the plane landed and he looked out the window and there was 60 cheerleaders actually waiting to greet him. And he got really, really worried. And he said, "My God, they'll smother me if they charge." Happily, they parted like the Red Sea, says Stephen Barry. They returned to the States in 1981, which was the wedding year. On both occasions, he met Nancy Reagan and was very taken with her. He likes bright, intelligent, older women, and Mrs. Reagan qualified on all counts. He was also really pleased that she said that she would come to the wedding of the Prince and Lady Diana Spencer. He was most gratified by that because he really did like her, although she did come alone. Now, a funny story was about the King of Nepal's coronation in 1975 because they headed off there with Lord Louis Mountbatten, and Stephen Barry was sort of tasked with looking after both of them. And there was double the luggage to check and pack because Lord Mountbatten loved every decoration, every order, every medal, every shiny bit he could find. When we arrived in Nepal from Delhi, where we'd rested for a couple of days, Lord Mountbatten took great pleasure in showing the prince around the presidential palace. Lord Mountbatten had lived there when he was Governor-General and acted as if he still was. Most of the servants had been at the palace in Lord Mountbatten's day, and they treated him as if he was a god. The prince was vastly amused by the whole thing. Now, also, Madame Marcos, you know, the lady with all the shoes, Madame Marcos of the Philippines, also came in for that coronation, and she used to just chase the prince. She was really after the prince to actually visit the Philippines, and she always brought with her, you know, stunning presents for him. And it was always a problem because he always wanted to make sure that he gave her an equally stunning present back. Now, it's interesting how Nepalese coronations take place because an astrologer determines when the crown is placed on the head. And so they're all waiting around, waiting for this ceremony to begin. And they waited and waited, sitting on long, hard benches. Suddenly, sometime after 9 o'clock, the astrologer threw up his hands and announced, "It is now." And the king, with the rest of the guests, sat bolt upright, and someone just literally plumped the crown down on his head and he was king. In no time at all. No sense of ceremony at all, says Lord Mountbatten. Every other year, the royals try to show their faces in Australia. No hardship for Prince Charles, as he really enjoys both Australia and the Australians. Perhaps it is because they do not get overexcited by the appearance of monarchy there. And it goes on to claim that the Australians don't queue to see the royals, but I would beg to differ. They do. They do. The prince would have loved to have lived there for a while. He loves the space and he finds the people outgoing and generous. He likes their outwardness in the same way as he likes Americans. There's no British reserve in Australia. They couldn't give a monkeys, really. Well, that sounds about right. They like him and they respect him, and that's the end of it. Therefore, he enjoys being treated with a certain respect, but appreciates that they are at ease with him. Yes, I think that is. We don't have the real sort of painful deference. We're sort of more ourselves, I would think. He spent 2 weekends there playing polo and as usual eating barbecue food. There was one elaborate barbecue which took place a 4-mile ride from the Hills home. Now, they were staying with the Hills, and Prince Charles knew them from his days at Timbertop, just outside Geelong. And Stephen Barry said he was in charge of making the pims, and he was given a horse too, and he had to ride off to the place, the site of the barbecue, and he got really sore because he wasn't used to riding. And the prince asked, "Are you sore?" He inquired sympathetically at the end of the day. "Yes, Your Highness, I am," I said with feeling. He telephoned Lady Diana quite often that trip, and she him. A story broke that there'd been a telephone leak with someone listening in to their conversations. It wasn't true. His phone calls were made mainly from Government House, and they were very brief. If anyone had been listening, they wouldn't have heard a great deal. We had one extremely funny evening on the tour. We were in Brisbane and invited to a variety concert, and the Prince was used to these overrunning. But Winifred Atwell, the honky-tonk piano player who had made a whole new career in Australia, was the top star in this Brisbane show. Well, Winnie used to get a bit drunk. She liked an odd drink or two, and it was 11:15 before she made her appearance on stage, and in the end she just played and played and played and played. In the end they put the curtain down on her, and they could still hear her still playing behind the curtain. And so the prince, by the time he'd thanked the stagehands and the lady who sells the ice cream, he got home at 1:45 in the morning. Now, I've got a little backup to that. When I was in Cairns and playing a contract at a hotel with my husband, the lady that played honky-tonk piano in the front bar was actually Winnie. And at that stage, she was in her late 80s, early 90s, and she still had it. She still got it. But she still liked a tipple or two before she started to play. I'll see you again very soon. Well, actually, next Friday. These are every Friday night, 9:30 p.m. We get more chapters of Royal Service. There's only a few more episodes to go, so don't miss any, will you? And make sure you like and subscribe and leave your comments down below. I'll see you then. Bye.